Total casualties for World War II totaled between 50 and 70 million people, 80% of which came from only 4 countries: Russia, China, Germany, and Poland. Over 50% of the casualties were civilians, with the majority of those being women and children. Our first story is about the 10th Mountain Division. And to share that, we have Bob Palmer, Navy. Bob Palmer.
Thank you, Connie. The 10th Mountain was an elite division trained to fight on skis, climb mountains, and thrive in cold weather. They trained in the mountains of Colorado just south and west of the present-day ski resort of Vail. The night of February 18, 1945, the German soldiers occupied the western side of the Pizzo de Campiano, a mountain in northern Italy. Their position commanded Highway 64, 3,000 feet below, and a vital roadway the U.S. Fifth Army needed to continue its drive up the Italian peninsula. If the Allies hoped to advance in safety, they'd need to clear the mountaintop dubbed Riva Ridge. With 400 of their comrades dug in by the village of Fanano near the base and believing the eastern face of the mountains unscalable, the men of Hitler's 1044 Grenadier Regiment dozed contentedly in their makeshift bivouacs. The sleeping Germans had no idea that their position was being quietly enveloped by teams of elite American soldiers who had climbed the strategically vital heights upon which the Wehrmacht troops were encamped. The raiders stealthily fanned out across the summit while their comrades did the same on 3 neighboring peaks. When all was ready, the U.S. troops struck, taking the Germans by surprise. By dawn, Riva Ridge was in Allied hands. Other summits would follow. The enemy counterattacked over the following 5 days, but were unable to recapture the important heights. Madam Chairman.
The 10th would be the last U.S. Army division to enter combat in World War II. They never managed to actually fight on skis. And Bob, you have a little more?
I was going to announce that my Palmer family has the distinction of having my Uncle Charlie, age 18, at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. He was on the USS Honolulu across the bay from the famous Arizona that was sunk.
Thank you, Bob. And just a little bit more about this 10th Mountain group. To be sure, other aspects of the 10th training came into play, particularly rock climbing and being there to survive and fight in mountainous terrain. But as far as ski combat, there was none. A Polish Catholic midwife delivered 3,000 babies at the Auschwitz concentration camp during the Holocaust in occupied Poland. Next, we have information about Ford, cars, fuel, rubber, presented by Ed Baumgartner, Navy. Ed?
Thank you. Prior to the U.S. entering the war in 1941, Ford made over 690,000 automobiles. Yet they only built around 160,000 vehicles for civilians in 1942. Before Ford's non-military car and truck line ceased operations on February 10th, the government then stockpiled remaining unsold cars and rationed them to those individuals deemed critical to public safety and the war effort: doctors, police, firefighters, farmers, and a rare handful of vital war workers. To be eligible for a new car, a person had to possess an older car with more than 40,000 miles on the odometer. For the years, spare parts and fuel would be limited, but the most painful automobile-related issue was tires. Soon after Pearl Harbor, Japan seized control of the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya, cutting off roughly 90 to 95% of Americans' natural rubber supply. What was left quickly consumed for the U.S. war effort. Goodyear reminded the public that while the construction of a battleship took nearly unimaginable amounts of high-grade steel, it also required more than 75 tons of rubber. Not to mention the mountains of life rafts, gas masks, Jeep tires, pontoon bridges, and tank tracks. Gasoline rationing and reduced speed limits had their roots in the preservation of rubber. Victory speed, 35 miles per hour, was initiated nationwide in May of 1942. The reduction in the speed saved fuel and doubled the life of tires compared to speeds of 60 miles per hour.
Every 5 German soldiers killed in the war died on the Eastern Front. A story that is close to home in Southern California involves the talent of a Hollywood legend. To share that story, we have John Collins, who told me he enlisted in the Air Force, then served as a Marine officer. Interesting. Would you please share, John?
In 1938, Bob Hope was selected as star and host for the Pepsodent Show, broadcast on NBC, after working for many years building a successful career from vaudeville to Broadway, radio, and film. The opening monologue of his May 6, 1941 show included the lines, "This is Bob Marchfield Hope, telling all aviators, while we can't advise you on how to protect your chutes, there's nothing like Pepsodent to protect your toots." His May 6, 1941 performance at Marchfield, California was the beginning of a new mission for Hope. His work took on added meaning when he was asked to perform his show outside of the studio in front of military audience. That day, he discovered his most cherished audience, the armed forces. After that performance, Hope drastically modified his show, normally recorded in a studio in front of a live audience, taking his wartime programs on the road to military camps and bases across the country. During the war, only 9 of Hope's 144 broadcasts were recorded in the studio. The rest were performed in front of troops on their home turf, whether that was on the home front or the fighting front. The radio show Command Performance was a perfect vehicle for Bob Hope, to whom the idea of performing for those in service was central. Broadcast from 1942 to 1949 by the Armed Forces Radio Service, AFRS, Command Performance was transmitted with few exceptions only to troops overseas, not on domestic stations. The Armed Forces Radio Service was a new division of the War Department, formed to bring entertainment, information, and education to military personnel over the airwaves. AFRS would become the Armed Forces Radio and Television Service and is now called the American Forces Network, with its broadcast facility located at where? March Air Reserve Base. It is estimated that by the time of his death at age 100 in 2003, Bob Hope had entertained more than 11 million troops. Bob Hope was MC of this show numerous times. And on July 7th, 1942, that broadcast was added to the National Recording Registry by the Library of Congress in 2005. Back to you, Connie.
Thank you, John. John Collins, who shared about Bob Hope. John, are you still there to share a little bit about your family connection to the Bob Hope story?
I am, Madam.
Okay, would you do so?
I have a personal connection to Bob Hope in the USO because my father participated in many USO shows. And the way he did that is because he was a trumpet player. In World War II, he served in the Army Air Corps, but he never saw any kind of fighting at the front lines because he was a member of the bass jazz band and dance band, and every base commander wanted to have a band. So if you had an extra tenor sax and needed a bass player, you'd do some horse trading. Well, after the war, he had a lot of great experience in bands, and he studied with people like his friends Dave Brubeck and others that you may have heard of. But he eventually went to big bands like Woody Herman and Les Brown. Les Brown and his band of renown was the house band for Bob Hope and his USO tours. And so my father went on many of these tours, at first to Germany, and then when Vietnam really cranked up, he was in Thailand, Vietnam, Guam, many other stations. And Bob Hope, I have to tell you, took care of his performers and his staff. As about a 9-year-old boy, I got to go to a Rose Bowl, sit on the 50-yard line with a whole crew of Bob Hope performers and staff as we watched the Washington Huskies beat the Minnesota Gophers. And Bob Hope didn't spare any expense. He bought these tickets on the 50-yard line and gave gifts to all of his performers and staff. That's one more quick comment, Connie, may I? Okay, and that is that my father's oldest brother enlisted before Pearl Harbor, and he was stationed in Manila in the Quartermaster Corps with the Army. When the Japanese invaded, they marched down to Manila and they conducted the Bataan Death March to a concentration camp several miles north. My uncle survived that, but died a few months later in 1942 in the concentration camp. They repatriated his remains only about 4 years ago, and I was pleased to receive those and then hold a ceremony in his honor at the Riverside National Cemetery, and I was pleased to do that. So I thought I'd mention that little World War II vignette for the good of the order. Back to you, Madam Toastmaster.
Thank you, John. The miraculous evacuation of Allied troops from Dunkirk saved 193,000 British and 145,000 French troops. A story of talent and fortitude describes the person in our next story. A famous quote of his is, "One chance is all you need." To share that story, we welcome Ed Thomas, Marine Corps. Ed?
A story of talent, fortitude describes the person of our next story. A famous quote of his was, "One chance is all you need." James Cleveland J.C. Owens was born September 12th, 1913 in Oakville, Alabama. His parents were sharecroppers. They had 10 children. Jesse was the youngest. The 11th Olympics game in Berlin began on August the 1st, 1936, with the opening ceremonies attended by Chancellor Adolf Hitler. The Nazis government used this technology, or the early technology of television, for limited broadcasting of the 1936 Olympics. It is estimated that 150,000 people watched the Olympics in 28 viewing rooms in the Berlin area. The 1936 games were the first to be televised. Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals in the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Jesse Owens won the 100-meter race, the long jump competition, where he defeated German Karl Lutz Long, the 200-meter sprint, and as a member of the 4-man 100-meter relay race. But 3 experiences in particular would be remembered in history. First, Jesse Owens did not fit the ideology, superiority, Aryan master race because of his color. Hitler refused to personally congratulate Jesse after his wins, and neither did President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Second, due to German government pressure, the US head coach, Larson Robertson, replaced Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller, the 2 Jewish members of the 4-man relay team, with Jesse Owens and his teammate, Ralph Metcalf. Jesse objected to the change, but he was told by Coach Roberts, and quote, "Do as you're told," unquote. The third, Jesse would remember and honor his friendship with the German long jump competitor Lutz Long for the rest of his life. Jesse fouled twice while attempting to qualify for the long jump event. He had only 1 attempt left. Lutz shared a technique with Jesse that helped him to qualify for the long jump. In the final long jump competition, Jesse won. Lutz finished second. Lutz was the first to congratulate him. And after the awards ceremony, Jesse and Lutz walked arm in arm through the Berlin Olympic Stadium. Lutz Long was sternly spoken to by the Nazi Party officials after his time spent with Jesse. Jesse and Lutz became friends at the Olympics and corresponded for years after that. Jesse would say of his friend Lutz, "It took a lot of courage for him to befriend me in front of Hitler. You can melt down all the medals and cups I have, and they wouldn't be plating for the 24-karat friendship that I felt for Lutz Long at that moment." Karl Lutz was wounded in Sicily, on July 10th, 1943, during an Allied invasion of Sicily in Operation Husky. He died in July 14th in a British military hospital. Jesse Owens died March 31st, 1980, in Tucson, Arizona. Madam Toastmaster.
Thank you, Ed. John R. McKinney was on guard duty in the Philippines when he was attacked in May 1945 by a large group of Japanese fighters. Over 36 minutes, he fought off the men using his skills with an M1 rifle, then hand-to-hand combat, ultimately killing 38 of their troops over 2 waves of fighting. His courage on that day earned McKinney the Medal of Honor. Most times we hear about the horror of war and the brutality. Our next story is one of honor between combatants. And to share that, we have Rick Danzy, Air Force. Rick, please.
Thank you, Madam Toastmaster. Most times we hear about the horrors of war and the brutality. Our next story is one of honor between combatants. On December 20th, 1943, American B-17 bomber pilot Charlie Brown and crew attempted to bomb an aircraft production facility in Germany. The factory was surrounded by 15 anti-aircraft guns, which damaged Brown's B-17. The damaged aircraft was then set upon by German fighter planes, which seriously wounded several crew members and knocked out all but one of the plane's 4 engines. While the fighters turned their attention to other prey, Brown's B-17 was spotted by German fighter pilot Franz Stigler, who was refueling. Stigler caught up with the plane and was about to shoot them down when he saw the crew was seriously wounded. Stigler was reluctant to attack a defenseless aircraft, so he instead pulled alongside the B-17 cockpit and signaled the crew to land. They refused. He then motioned in the direction of Sweden. Stigler flew side by side with the bomber, afraid his own military might identify him, for his behavior could have gotten him executed. As the bomber approached the safety of the English Channel, Stigler saluted, peeled off. Miraculously, Brown kept the plane in the air and made it to England. He often wondered why his German counterpart hadn't shot him down. So after the war, he placed an ad in the World War II newsletter for pilot veterans. Stigler, who had relocated to Canada, spotted the ad. The two reunited, and Stigler explained that to shoot at them would have been dishonorable. The pair became close friends. I would hope I would have that same honor. Madam Toastmaster.
Thank you, Rick. The mortality rate for the POWs in Russian camps was 85%. Our next person to share is John Reese, Navy. John Reese.
Many schools of yesteryear glossed over or totally ignored the history of minority groups. The history of the Black Panthers is one that is frequently overlooked. Men, you are the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my Army. I don't care what color you are, so long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches. Everyone has your eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down. This was General George Patton talking to the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers. While most combat troops fought in the front for a week or two before being rotated back, the men of the 761st served for more than 6 months, fighting heroically under Patton's Third Army at the Battle of the Bulge and in the Allies' final drive across France and Germany. Their motto, come out fighting. After the D-Day invasion, the 761st was sent to France. During the fall of 1944, General Patton selected the 761st to be part of the Saar campaign in the Allied drive to the Siegfried Line near the border of Germany and France. On November the 8th, 1944, the battalion joined with the 104th Infantry and the 26th Infantry Divisions in an attack on German positions in northeastern France. As they were entering the town, A roadblock improvised by the Germans using a falling tree and several landmines stopped the progress of the tank battalion and the infantry. The Germans were then trained their fire on the tanks and the infantrymen stranded in the roadside ditches. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, who was positioned in Able Company's lead tank, dismounted from his tank in the face of enemy small arms fire, attached a cable to the road blocking tree, and moved it off the road, which permitted the combat team to proceed. His actions prevented a serious delay in the overall offensive, which included the capture of the town. For this action, Rivers was awarded the Black Panthers' first Silver Star. In 1978, after a long delay, the Black Panthers were awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. In 1997, Sergeant Reuben Rivers was awarded the highest military award, the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was one of 7 African Americans to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. He was one of 11 brothers and sisters. His Medal of Honor citation reads as follows: for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Staff Sergeant Rivers distinguished himself by extraordinary heroism in action during 16 to 19 November 1944, while serving with Company A's 761st Tank Battalion. On 16 November 1944, while advancing toward the towns of Gerbling, France, Staff Sergeant Rivers' tank hit a mine at a railroad crossing. Although severely wounded, his leg slashed to the bone, Staff Sergeant Rivers declined an injection of morphine, refused to be evacuated, took command of another tank, and advanced with his company into Gerbling the next day. Repeatedly refusing evacuation, Staff Sergeant Rivers continued to direct his tank's fire at enemy positions beyond the town through the morning of the 19th of November 1944. At dawn that day, Company A's tanks advanced toward Berghof, their next objective, but were stopped by enemy fire. Captain David J. Williams, the company commander, ordered his tanks to withdraw and take cover. Staff Sergeant Rivers, however, radioed that he had spotted the German anti-tank positions. "I see him, we'll fight him." Staff Sergeant Rivers, joined by another Company A tank, opened fire on enemy tanks, covering Company A as they withdrew. While doing so, Staff Sergeant Rivers' tank was hit, killing him and wounding the rest of the crew. Staff Sergeant Rivers' fighting spirit and daring leadership were an inspiration to his unit and exemplify the highest traditions of military service. Madam President.
Thank you, John. Okay, please welcome John. You had one more item?
There's a little bit of trivia. My last name is Reese, R-E-E-C-E. Mom, I always said if Mom had known how to spell, I'd be heir to the peanut butter cup fortune, but that's not quite true. However, among the 1,177 sailors entombed in the hulk of the USS Arizona is a fellow by the name of John Jeffers Reese, with a C. At the same time, on the USS Maryland, 3 ships down the battleship row, there was a Billy Dick Reese. 7 years later, he became my father.
Thank you, John. If everybody is thinking alike, then somebody is not thinking. A quote from General Patton. Next, to share about code talkers, Greg Scott, Air Force. Greg Scott.
Thank you, Madam Toastmaster, and Merry Christmas to all my Toastmaster friends. Code talkers. Raise your hand if you heard about the Navajo code talkers in World War II. Wow, a lot of folks have heard that. Well, the following information I'm going to share may add to your knowledge of the code talkers. The idea of using American Indians who were fluent in both the traditional tribal language and English to send secret messages in battle was first put to test in World War I with the Choctaw Telephone Squad and other native communication experts and messengers. However, it wasn't until World War II that the United States military developed a specific policy to recruit and train American Indians speakers to become code talkers. Of the roughly 400 code talkers who served in World War II, 13 were killed in action. After one code talker was almost executed as a Japanese soldier, bodyguards were assigned for their safety and the protection of the American intelligence. Despite the historic contributions during the war, American Indian code talkers were told that they had to keep their work secret since the codes that they developed remained unbroken. The United States military wanted to keep this program classified in case the code talkers were needed in the future wars. It wasn't until 2001 that Congress, a congressional medal, a gold medal was given to the Navajo, as well as over 25 tribes, in which included Cherokee, Cheyenne, Choctaw, Crow, Hopi, Pawnee, Apache, Mohawk, Sioux, and many, many other tribes. The members of the Choctaw tribe and other nations were served also distinguished in the native languages during not only World War II, but in Korea and in Vietnam. God bless them all. Madam Toastmaster.
Thank you, Greg. Hitler was ruthless and cruel in his treatment of his own military leaders, executing no fewer than 84 of his own generals over the duration of the war. Most of the executions were due to the discovery that the men were plotting against him. To share next, we have Roger Bowman, Navy. Roger Bowman.
Thank you, Connie. An American duo worked not only for America, but for Germany. This is their story. In the dark of night before D-Day morning, June 6, 1944, thousands of American paratroopers were dropped behind enemy lines. One of the main objectives of the 101st Airborne was to capture the small French village of Angeville-Applon. When intense fighting broke out over the village, two American medics, Robert Wright and Kenneth Moore, set up a medical station in the tiny town church. The airborne ranger troops gained control of the town, but German units counterattacked and forced the American soldiers back. As there were by now dozens of wounded in the church, the two medics, Wright and Moore, stayed behind. Soon, German troops stormed into the church and, upon encountering American soldiers, treated them hostilely as prisoners. That is, until they realized the medics were treating German wounded as well as the American. The Germans quickly changed their stance and posted a Red Cross flag at the church entrance. For the next 3 days, as fighting raged just outside the church, the village changed hands several times, but the two medics toiled away, saving 80 lives, including a local village teenager. Today, you can go and see the church, where the villagers replaced the battle-damaged windows with stained glass tributes to Wright, Moore, and the 101st Airborne.
Thank you. A Rommel quote, "For me, soldiers are all equal. Those Black people wore your same uniform, fought on your side, and so you will be in the same jail." Another fact, an estimated 60% of the 1,750,000 Japanese troops who died in World War II were lost to malnutrition and disease. Sharing next is Daryl Zeller, Air Force. Daryl Zeller.
Thank you, Connie. In 1941, Joe Medicine Crow enlisted in the infantry as a scout, following the footsteps of his step-grandfather. Throughout the war, he wore his paint under his uniform, and he tucked a sacred yellow eagle feather under his helmet. Joe Medicine Crow served as a scout for the 103rd Infantry Division, and he fought across France and into Germany during his service. As a scout, Medicine Crow was not typically a frontline combatant, but his unit did accompany an assault on the Sacred Line. During the battle, an American unit was wiped out while carrying explosives that would punch a line in the defenses. Medicine Crow and 7 others were ordered to finish the job. They crossed heavy enemy machine gun fire to retrieve the explosives and blasted through the line. Medicine Crow was awarded a Bronze Star for his heroics. In addition to the Bronze Star with Valor that he earned during his World War II service, Joe Medicine Crow has been honored with several awards for both his military service and his work as a Crow historian. After World War II ended in 1945, he went on to become the Crow tribal historian and spent the rest of his life retelling the history of the Crow people before he passed in 2016 at 102 years of age. In 2008, the French awarded him the National Order of Honor medal for his service. A year later, President Barack Obama awarded Medicine Crow the Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor. He was nominated for a Congressional Gold Medal. Awarded Medicine Crow the Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor. He was
Thank you, Daryl.
Congressional Gold.
And the other individual who has just a bit to share is Daryl. Daryl, you want to share your story with us?
Okay. I chose to talk about a Native American because I was raised in northern part of South Dakota, just east of the Missouri River. West of the Missouri River was the Rosebud Indian Reservation. My dad's sister and her family lived over there in the reservation near Trail City where they prospered. My mother's cousins, the Johnson boys, lived over on the Rosebud Reservation also, where they farmed and prospered. Now, what was most interesting about the Rosebud Reservation was probably that Sitting Bull's descendants went up into North Dakota, exhumed his body, and brought it back and buried it on the reservation just a few miles west of Mobridge out of 10 tons of concrete, because they said nobody's going to be able to steal his remains again. And buried it on the reservation just a few miles west of Mobridge. Out of 10
Thank you, Darrell.
tons of concrete.
Be an example to your men in your duty and in private life. That's a quote from Erwin Rommel. Sharing next will be Jose Vizcarra, Army. Jose Vizcarra.
Thank you. Company E of the 141st Infantry, part of the 36th Division, was assigned to the 5th Army in North Africa under General Mark Clark. Company E was made up exclusively of Mexican Americans. On September 9, 1943, the 36th spearheaded the Allied invasion of the Italian mainland at Salerno. It became the first American unit to fight Hitler's forces on the European continent. PFC Ramon Gutierrez from Del Rio, Texas, and his platoon had been pinned down by 4 German Mark IV tanks and fire from a machine gun nest. After witnessing members of his unit killed, Gutierrez charged the machine gun nest, firing his Browning automatic rifle until it was shot out of his hands. Although wounded, he continued to advance on the German machine gun position. He closed in and tossed a grenade into the machine gun nest. The blast killed 3 enemy soldiers. Gutierrez then jumped into the nest and killed a 4th enemy soldier with his knife. For his actions at Salerno, Gutierrez will be awarded the Silver Star. The Soviet Union, which had an observer at Salerno, will also present the Order of Patriotic War, 2nd degree, to Gutierrez. Sergeant Rafael Q. Torres of El Paso, Texas, led his squad at the Salerno bloodshed. Torres was one of 6 Torres' brothers serving in the armed forces during the war. Torres' squad was also stopped by German armor when he fought off several German tanks with a grenade launcher and a Springfield rifle. In a span of 48 hours, the 36th will lose over 2,000 men in the failed attempt to cross the El Rápido at the heavily defended German Gustav line. Of the 154 men of Company E that crossed the Rápido in January 1944, only 27 returned from across the river. Some of the men continue on to seek action at Anzio in Velletri and will enter the eternal city of Rome. A few more will also make the landing in southern France during Operation Dragon. They came from places like Del Rio, Uvalde, Sonora, Kingsville, and El Paso, Texas. These soldiers and their families served this nation when their country needed them the most. They were true American patriots who helped to come from the barrios of Texas. Thank you, Madam Toastmaster.
Thank you, Jose. The Nazi hunger plan led to the deaths of over 2 million Soviet prisoners in 1941. Sharing next will be Kimberly Smith Austin, Army. Kimberly Smith Austin.
Attractive, talented, born Frida Josephine McDonald in 1906 in St. Louis, Missouri. Josephine Baker grew up poor and was wed for the first time in her early teens. A dancer, she went on to tour the United States with vaudeville troupes and perform on Broadway before moving to Paris in 1985, where she skyrocketed to fame in the city's music halls. Baker, whose name included Black Venus and who also sang and acted in movies, became a major celebrity in Europe and a symbol of the 1920s jazz age. Her scorn for the Nazis' racism, coupled with her gratitude towards France, where she first experienced stardom, led Baker to serve during the war as an operative for the French resistance. Her performing career enabled her to travel around Europe without attracting suspicion, and she attended numerous parties at embassies, gleaning whatever military and political information she could that might aid the resistance, often smuggling intelligence secrets on invisible ink on her sheet music. She also used her chateau in southern France to hide Jewish refugees as well as weapons for the cause. Following the war, Baker, who received multiple awards from the French for her contributions to the war effort, became active in the American Civil Rights Movement, but continued to make her home in France, where she resided with her 12 children. Yes, I said 12. She adopted from around the globe and whom she referred to as her rainbow tribe. Back to you, Madam Toastmaster.
Thank you, Kimberly. The siege of Stalingrad resulted in more Russian deaths, military and civilian, than the United States and Britain sustained combined in all of World War II. Cheering next will be Jeff Horn, Army. Jeff Horn.
As forgotten stories go, you may not remember or heard of the only land battle on American soil during World War II, known as the Battle of Attu. The chain of roughly 150 islands lay just 750 miles away from the closest military base in Japan, closer to Japan than to Seattle, Washington. In June 1942, the Japanese attacked the Aleutian Islands. Regional naval officers directed Japanese forces to bomb an American military base at Dutch Harbor, killing more than 100 Americans. Within a week, Japan's northern area fleet pushed forward and seized the islands of Adak and Kiska, marking the first time that American territory had been occupied since the War of 1812. Directing an armada of 176 warships, Admiral Yamamoto hoped to use the invasion of the Aleutians to lure the North American naval forces, which were crippled after the attack on Pearl Harbor, into the fight. The Japanese thought that by diverting the American Navy to the Aleutians, the major portion of Yamamoto's fleet could safely strike elsewhere in the Pacific. On June 4th, 1942, at nearly the same time the Japanese bombed Dutch Harbor, American and Japanese forces converged on Midway Island to fight the battle which would be seen later as the turning point of the war in the Pacific. By the end of the month, the Japanese had retreated from the island, but not before demonstrations of their code of honor, including mass suicides and take no prisoner battles to the death, convinced Americans that they were fighting an unrelenting enemy. In late July, the Japanese discreetly withdrew from the island of Kiska, ending the nearly one-year operation of the Aleutian Islands. An invasion of the continental United States seemed less likely, and the urgency and importance of the Alaska Highway faded. Madam Toastmaster.
Thank you, Jeff. Only one out of every 4 men serving on U-boats survived. Our final story will be shared by Morris Anderson, Army. Morris Anderson.
A story that many have never heard is about Susan Ann Cuddy. Serving in the military as a woman in World War II was personal. In 1937, her father was killed by the Japanese during a visit to Seoul and now South Korea for speaking out against Japanese occupation and oppression of Korea. 3 years later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. Cuddy and her 2 brothers became determined to join the US's fight against Japan, and all 3 joined the US military. Cuddy graduated from San Diego University and applied to join the WAVES program and was rejected. Despite facing overwhelming discrimination as a woman and as an Asian American living in the United States following Pearl Harbor, Cuddy applied to WAVES again, and she became the first Asian woman to join the US Navy. Cuddy became a link trainer, instructing aviators in air combat tactics. Later, she would become the first female gunnery officer in the US Navy, teaching naval aviators how to fire a .50 caliber machine gun. She would retire from the Navy as a lieutenant and would go back on to work for US Navy Intelligence, the Library of Congress, and the National Security Agency. She passed away in 2015 at the age of 100.
We now have a very special guest indeed. I recently met Val Burgess by email and telephone, and so I'm so pleased to actually see her in person on Zoom. Val has been so involved with stories about veterans through her Wars Voices World War II POW project. She's a historian, a TEDx speaker. She has a special speech for us this evening. The title, First Action, First Words Spoken, First War for a Young Man. Please welcome Val Burgess.
The fire chief said to the men, "It's Sunday, I don't think we'll have much to do. The flight line is really quite slow on Sunday, so probably there'll be no fires we need to fight." Let's stop back just a little bit to fill in this story. On July 1st, 1941, 17-year-old Melvin Hackman, he picked his duty station, the Naval Air Base called Ford Island in Pearl Harbor. He was at his best when he worked Monday through Friday, assembling aircraft and repairing them. But every 4 weeks, he had to show up and serve for 24 hours in whatever job they had for him. It just so happened that 24-hour job started on December 7th, 1941. It was supposed to end at 8 o'clock in the morning, but that duty lasted a lot longer than he expected. Mel reported to the fire station at 7:45 on December 7th. Purdy was there and the fire chief, and they talked about duties. All of a sudden, there was an aircraft that came over. It was an unusual aircraft. It had or red circles on the wings. As luck would have it, or for that pilot, he moved over, he cut the cable that connected the naval fleet to the mainland. Prudy, who recognized that aircraft, he started waving his arm in the air and he kept saying, "Those blankety blank blank, those blankety blank blanks." And so quite soon that aircraft headed off and bombed the hangar that stored aviation fuel. Those guys jumped on the back of the fire truck. They had their feet on the platform and held onto the bar. They took off. But then a fighter came in after them. He started peppering the ground, the asphalt. It looked like boiling water. And that black tar was popping up. It was burning Purdy and Mel's back. They had burns on their arms and any open skin because the asphalt was so hot. Soon a bomb was dropped at about 60 feet behind them. But the fire chief got them out of there and they stopped at the bay. They were going to fill the engine, the fire truck, with water. But the hoses were so badly damaged, they had to abandon that. The fire chief took them on further down the bay to the end of Ford Island. And there behind them was a house. He said to the men, "That's my home. My wife is there. You protect it." And so he took off to help elsewhere. Purdy and Mel stood there looking around, and they looked straight ahead of them. And there was the USS Arizona, the West Virginia, the Oklahoma, and on down the way. Very quickly, the whole sky filled with aircraft, bombers, fighters, torpedo guns. There was a high altitude bomber that came in, dropped a piercing bomb that hit the front deck of the Arizona. It went right through the deck and blew the magazine. Very quickly, they saw torpedo planes that were flying very close to the surface of the water. They dropped their torpedoes. It was perfect. Suddenly, they exploded simultaneously. Mel said he saw the Arizona lift up out of the water and then it broke and went down. She carried with her 1,177 men, one of Mr. Reese's family members. Hickman and Prudy had to hold on to each other around a palm tree because the winds, the percussion of those bombs was over 100 miles an hour. Soon they heard voices screaming, "Help me, help me, help me." And they noticed in the water the gasoline, all the fuel that was burning, and the men were trying to swim through it. Mel bent over and picked up a man out of the water. Unfortunately, this man was only from his waist up. He held him in his arms until he died, and then he let him slip back in to the water. That day, Mel Heckman helped 15 other men who survived. One man, Mel Heckman, was just 17 years old. On December 7th, on December 7th, 2016, Mel Heckman, one of the very few survivors of Pearl Harbor, returned there for the very first time in his life. Surrounded by family members, they went back to the places where the first sound, the first words, and his first war experience began. Mel was respected. He earned a Purple Heart and is now memorialized at the World War II Valor in the Pacific National Monument at Pearl Harbor. Mel asked me to continue to tell his story because he didn't want to be forgotten. I respect him and so many others I've been able to interview because truly their stories need to be told to so many people, especially our children today. In 1995, I was fortunate to travel with 127 former prisoners of war back to the Great Escape prison camp of World War II fame. We went to their camp, we followed their forced march, we ended up in southern Germany, where they were liberated from another camp. The Germans celebrated them. I learned about their war. I started recording their stories. That was 28 years ago. Our War's Voices archives holds approximately 200 oral histories. We have the largest collection of Radio Tokyo letters. We have personal accounts, photos, letters, unit histories, and manuscripts. It is my mission to tell their stories for the remainder of my life. Last night, I gave this speech to a Toastmasters club, a different Toastmasters club. And someone said to me, "Why are you wearing those clothes?" And I said, well, this is a uniform that the women air service pilots might have worn. And I wear it because it brings me closer to them. And that's always what I hope, is to share their stories in a way that they would be proud. Madam Toastmaster.
Thank you for sharing, Val, for sharing Mel's story and for all the other stories you have shared and will continue to share. We appreciate that. Your position is very, very important. And I hope we get to hear many more of those. By the way, Val is joining us from Sheridan, Wyoming.